when 18-year-old Blake Harrison stepped onto America's biggest singing stage. The audience couldn't even understand his name when he introduced himself. 3 minutes later, all four coaches had tears streaming down their faces, and 20 million viewers were witnessing the most stunning transformation in television history. Blake had spent his entire life in Millbrook, Tennessee, a small town where the local diner served as both breakfast spot and evening gossip central. Born with a severe stutter that made every conversation feel like climbing a mountain with broken legs, Blake learned early that words were his enemy. Simple phrases like asking for directions or ordering food became monumental challenges that left him red-faced and retreating into silence. Elementary school was brutal. While other kids raised their hands eagerly to answer questions, Blake would sink lower into his seat, praying teachers wouldn't call on him. When they did, the classroom would fall into that uncomfortable quiet that stretched like taffy as Blake struggled to push sounds through his locked throat. The harder he tried, the worse it got. His face would contort, his hands would shake, and eventually, he'd give up a defeated shake of his head. Middle school brought a different kind of torture. 13-year-old bullies discovered that mimicking Blake's stutter was guaranteed entertainment. Tyler Watson, the class clown with perfect teeth and a cruel streak, would stand behind Blake in lunch lines doing exaggerated impressions. BBB Blake wants his FFF French fries. He announced to anyone within earshot. The cafeteria would erupt in laughter, and Blake would abandon his tray, spending lunch period hiding in the library where silence was not just accepted but required. His parents, David and Linda Harrison, tried everything. Speech therapy sessions twice a week with Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman who taught breathing techniques and tongue exercises that never seemed to work when Blake needed them most. They enrolled him in confidence-building camps, bought every self-help book on stuttering, and even considered moving to a new town where Blake could start fresh. Nothing worked. The stutter clung to him like a shadow, growing darker during moments when he needed his voice most. High school should have been a fresh start, but reputation follows you in small towns. Blake became known as a quiet kid, the one you didn't bother talking to because conversations took too long. Teachers learned to avoid calling on him during class discussions. Group projects became nightmares where Blake would do all the written work, but let others handle presentations. He existed in the margins of teenage life, watching his classmates navigate first dates, job interviews, and college prep with the kind of verbal confidence that felt as foreign to him as flying. But Blake had a secret that nobody knew, not even his parents who thought they knew everything about their struggling son. Every day after school, Blake would walk the half-mile to Miller's Creek, a quiet spot where the water moved slowly between moss-covered rocks and old oak trees, created a natural amphitheater. Here, where no human ears could judge him, Blake would sing. Not speak, not struggle with consonants and vowels. Sing. His voice would pour out clear and strong, carrying melodies that made the songbirds stop their own singing to listen. He started with hymns his grandmother used to hum while baking apple pies. Then classic rock songs he'd memorized from his father's vinyl collection. Eventually, he discovered contemporary ballads that seemed written for his particular brand of heartbreak. When Blake sang, the stutter disappeared completely. His voice was rich and soulful, carrying emotions he could never express in regular conversation. The water would carry his notes downstream, and for those precious moments, Blake felt like the person he was meant to be. For 3 years, Miller's Creek was his private concert hall. He'd sing everything from Johnny Cash to Ed Sheeran, developing a style that was uniquely his own. His voice matured from the uncertain warble of a 15-year-old to something powerful and haunting. He learned to control his breathing, to build emotional crescendos, to make listeners feel every word even when he couldn't speak them in conversation. Blake never told anyone about his singing. How could he explain that the boy who couldn't order pizza over phone could deliver a flawless rendition of Hallelujah to the Tennessee wilderness? It felt too precious to share, too vulnerable to risk having it ruined by the judgment that followed him everywhere else. The turning point came during his senior year, when Blake's English teacher, Mrs. Campbell, assigned a presentation on overcoming personal challenges. While other students chose safe topics like learn to drive or making the basketball team, Blake faced an impossible choice. He could either give a stuttering, painful presentation about his speech impediment or fail the assignment that would significantly impact his final grade. The night before presentation, Blake sat by Miller's Creek later than usual, singing until his voice was hoarse. As he prepared to leave, he noticed someone sitting on a fallen log about 50 feet away. His heart stopped. How long had they been there? How much had they heard? The figure stood and walked toward him. In the moonlight, Blake recognized Sarah Chun, a girl from his English class who'd always been kind but never really talked to him. Sarah approached slowly, as if afraid she might spook a deer. "Blake," she said softly, "that was incredible. I had no idea you could sing like that." Blake's face burned with embarrassment. His secret sanctuary had been invaded. He tried to respond, to explain, but the words tangled his throat like they always did. Sarah waited patiently, then said something that changed everything. "You know there's a local talent show next month, right? Winner get $1,000 and a chance to audition for The Voice. Blake, with a voice like that, you could change your whole life." The suggestion was ridiculous. Blake couldn't even order coffee without struggling, let alone perform in front of hundreds of people. But Sarah's words planted a seed that grew stronger each day. What if singing could be his way out? What if the voice that worked perfectly by the creek could work on stage too? 3 weeks later, against every logical instinct, Blake found himself backstage at the Millbrook Community Center's annual talent show. His hands shook as he watched other performers take the stage. A dance troupe from the local studio, a comedian who got polite chuckles, a band of college students doing covers of popular songs. When his name was called, Blake's legs barely carried him to center stage. The lights were blindingly bright, and he could see faces in the audience but couldn't make out individual expressions. Someone handed him a microphone that felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hands. "Could you state your name for the audience?" the announcer asked cheerfully. This was the moment Blake had dreaded. He leaned toward the microphone and tried to speak. "My name is B.B. Blake, H.H. Harrison." The stutter was worse than ever, amplified to the sound system for everyone to hear. He could feel the audience's discomfort, that familiar, awkward silence he'd known his entire life. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of trying to speak again, Blake simply started to sing. The first note that came from his throat was pure and strong, carrying across the auditorium like it was meant to fill that exact space. He'd chosen "Stand By Me," a song he'd sung hundreds of times by the creek. But this version was different. It carried 18 years of pain, hope, and dreams that had never found their voice. The transformation was immediate and complete. The boy who couldn't say his own name without struggling delivered each lyric with perfect clarity and devastating emotion. His voice filled every corner of the community center, and the audience fell into the kind of complete silence that only comes when something truly special is happening. Blake closed his eyes and let the music carry him. He wasn't in front of 300 judgmental neighbors anymore. He was by his creek, singing to the water and the trees and the endless Tennessee sky. His voice soared through the chorus, adding runs and emotional inflections he'd never attempted before. This wasn't just singing. It was 18 years of suppressed communication pouring out in perfect harmony. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then the applause began, not the polite clapping that had followed other acts, but genuine, thunderous appreciation. People rose to their feet, and Blake opened his eyes to see faces that showed amazement, tears, and something he'd never seen directed at him before, respect. Blake won the talent show unanimously. The $1,000 prize was nice, but the real victory was hearing his name announced clearly and loudly as the winner. For the first time in his life, his stutter didn't define the moment. 6 months later, Blake found himself in Los Angeles, standing in the wings of the Voice stage. The producers had been skeptical during his initial audition interview. His stutter was still severe when speaking, but when he sang his audition song, a soulful version of Tennessee Whiskey, they knew they had something special. Now, facing the biggest moment of his life, Blake felt that familiar terror creeping in. For celebrity coaches sat with their backs turned, waiting to hear what this nervous young man from Tennessee could do. Carson daily introduced him to the television audience, and Blake could hear his own stuttering introduction broadcast to millions of viewers. "My name is B.B. Blake Harrison, and I'm 18 years old from Millbrook, Tennessee." The coaches shifted in their chairs, and Blake could sense their discomfort. This was national television, after all, and stuttering didn't make for smooth entertainment. He saw doubt flicker across Carson's face and knew the producers were probably wondering if they'd made a mistake. But Blake had learned something important over the past 6 months. His stutter wasn't his weakness. It was proof of his strength. Every word he struggled with in conversation made his singing voice more powerful. Every moment of silence he'd endured made his music more meaningful. The boy who'd hidden by Miller's Creek had become a young man who understood that sometimes the most beautiful voices come from the most broken places. The music began, and Blake chose the song that brought him this far, Stand By Me, but this version was different from the one he'd sung at the community center. This carried the weight of dreams deferred and finally pursued, of a lifetime of silence finally finding its voice. The first note exploded from his throat with such power and clarity that all 4 coaches straightened in their chairs. By the third line, John Legend's hand was hovering over his button. By the first chorus, Blake Shelton had spun around with his mouth hanging open. Kelly Clarkson turned during the bridge, her face already showing tears. Ariana Grande held out until the final chorus, but when she finally spun, she was on her feet applauding. 4 red chairs for celebrity coaches, and 1 young man who'd proven that the voice you're given isn't nearly as important as finding the courage to use it. When the song ended, the silence was deafening. Then all 4 coaches stood, applauding not just the performance but the journey they'd witnessed. Blake looked out at the audience, at the cameras, at the coaches who were now fighting over the chance to work with him. And for the first time in his life, his stutter didn't matter. John Legend spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. Blake, I've been doing this for years, and I've never heard anything like that. You didn't just sing that song. You lived it. Your voice has a quality that can't be taught, can't be manufactured. It comes from somewhere real, somewhere honest. Kelly Clarkson wiped tears from her eyes. Honey, when you started talking, I thought this might be tough to watch. But when you open your mouth to sing, I got goosebumps. You have a gift that's bigger than any challenge you faced. That's not just talent, that's purpose. Blake chose Kelly as his coach, and 6 months later, he made it to the finals of The Voice. He didn't win the competition, but he'd already won something more important. Proof that the voice inside him was stronger than the stutter that had defined his childhood. Today, Blake Harrison tours the country, performing in venues that range from intimate clubs to major arenas. He still stutters when he speaks, but now he embraces it as part of his story. Before each concert, he tells his audience about the boy who hid by Miller's Creek, afraid his voice would never be heard. Then he sings, and his voice carries the message that every person in every audience needs to hear. Your challenges don't define your limits. They define your strength. Your struggles don't predict your failure. They predict your unique path to success. And sometimes, the thing you're most afraid to share with the world is exactly what the world needs to hear. Blake learned that silence isn't the absence of voice. It's the pause before finding the right way to use it. And when you finally find your voice, whether it's through song, art, writing, or simply living authentically, the world listens. Not because your voice is perfect, but because it's real, it's earned, and it carries the truth of every challenge you've overcome to let it be heard. The boy who couldn't say his name without struggling became the man whose voice reminds millions of people that their struggles are not their endings. They're their beginnings. And every time Blake Harrison steps onto a stage, takes a breath, and lets his voice fill the space around him, he proves that the most powerful voices often come from the quietest places.